Hey, it's Ben Ufana. Um, Recently, in a conversation, a friend of mine said something to the effect of, if what you're saying is true, you should be able to attract love wherever you go. And I wish it were that simple. On one hand, yes, as you go through your healing process, as you're healing a lot of the trauma that, say, if you have a traumatic past, if you're carrying a lot of traumas, that heals. Maybe there's other emotional wounding, say from past relationships, breakups. And as that heals, as you continue to progress along your healing journey, definitely what happens is you do develop a more attractive presence, and that increases your capacity to love, to be loved. You're far more likely to attract those individuals into your life with whom you can establish a deeply loving, fulfilling, more meaningful relationship, or co-create that relationship. However, there are also circumstances that in many instances are beyond your control. And when you find yourself in some of these circumstances or whatever, sometimes relationships or love doesn't come as easy as you would want it to. And the unfortunate thing is, I see a lot of people blame themselves for the fact that they're not in a relationship and not really taking into consideration or fully understanding the fact that the circumstance that they find themselves in are just not as conducive for that loving, intimate bond attachment to form or to develop. So it's easy for me to share from my own personal experience, and also that of some of the people that I've worked with over the years, to illustrate the points I want to make here. I will refer to my notes here, just because I want to remember everything that's important to say. As I mentioned before, when I get on camera, sometimes it can be like, I can feel like a deer in the headlights sometimes. But anyway, so growing up, much of that time in Southeast Texas, I just wasn't on the right wavelength. It was different culture, different values. And yeah, sometimes I would, as in my teens, I would, even as a boy, start forming these boyhood crushes, and through my adolescence. And often I was met with like, oh, I just like you as a friend. And in many instances, it seemed that if the girls I was attracted to at that time, they had a crush on someone else, which wasn't the most, comforting experience at that time, as an adolescent and looking outside of myself for validation. I wasn't getting it. But from an early childhood, I had this fascination. Somehow I was just drawn to Native Americans and their culture and everything. So by the time I was 17, I'd already taken off on my own, right after finishing my junior year of high school. And the car that I bought carried me as far as Oklahoma. And I landed in a community of predominantly Kiowa Indians in the southwestern part of the state. And right off, like one of my younger friends, who's about my age, I don't know why I'm congested today, but he introduced me to his father, who was in charge of what they refer to as the Native American church, was they, with the federal government, they created like this sort of political entity that would oversee those Native Americans who would go into the peyote meetings just to, because peyote is a controlled substance. But anyway, so this, my friend's father, he just opened the door for me, or opened the teepee door, basically. So I ended up spending a lot of time sitting up in the peyote meetings with the Kiowa elders. I became so immersed in the culture. I had those huge feather bustles. I was dancing in the powwows. I was just so immersed in the culture that many assumed that I was of mixed heritage, and were at times shocked when they found out, like, what, you're all white. But during those days, wanting to be accepted, whatever, part of the community, I would stay in the sun as much as I can to do everything I could to get as dark as I could. And I managed to pass for half-breed even. But and living among Native Americans, in many ways, I did become part of the community, and I felt strong resonance with many of the Native people, and relationships did come easier, and it was a very different dynamic, because here I was in that transitional stage from between adolescence and early adulthood, and so the young Native women would actually, if they were interested, they would let you know. They made it pretty clear and much more forward. And on one hand, I would have loved to continue to live among the Native people for the remainder of my life. I forgot to throw in there too, like, not only was I immersed in the culture, going to powwows and peyote meetings and all that, but I actually went on to apprentice with one of the last surviving traditional Native doctors among the Kiowa Indian tribe, an actual medicine man. So my mentor, Horace, would, he was extraordinarily powerful, and he would transmit portions of his own healing gifts to me. He would have me assist him as he worked with people. And at times he would transmit portions of his own healing gifts to me. When he'd do that, he would have me go to fast alone in the mountains for 4 days and nights without food and water, mountains or desert, whatever, depending on where we were at that time. And and I apprenticed for a few years with Horace, and I've continued with my training, going through the Vision Quest, even since that time, for many years now. But one of the big challenges are, I'm not sure if that's the best way to describe it, but one of the difficulties that Native Americans and peoples of other indigenous cultures have to contend with is just the frequency of alcoholism. And to my understanding, Native Americans also have one of the largest groups of people who completely abstain from alcohol. And yet, in the Native communities back on the reservations and all, there's a high rate of alcoholism. I wonder if some of that has to do with the trauma, because for decades, Native children were taken from their families, put in boarding schools. Many of them were subjected to beating. They were humiliated because of their indigenous heritage, were forbidden to speak their own languages, and many were also sexually abused as well. And so you have just generations of Native people who experienced just horrific trauma and not having much of any means to really cope with that. And many of these, maybe, I think that too may have contributed to the high rate of alcoholism. And the other is just the fact that you have these cultures that, for thousands of years, they had no access to alcohol. It just didn't exist within the culture, with few exceptions. But Native Americans, Australian Aborigines, Tibetans, and other indigenous groups of people tend to have higher frequency of alcoholism. They become more easily addicted. But and on one hand, you have many of the Native people moving into the cities to raise their families, to pursue their careers and their education and all that. But it's just in the Native communities where I lived, there was this incredibly self-destructive, very degenerative element, and it was all alcohol related. A number of my peers were dying as a result of alcohol-related violence, car crashes. One good friend of mine died after passing out, and in sub-freezing temperatures. He died of exposure. And so feeling overwhelmed by what I was seeing and not knowing, quite how to cope with it, I bailed out at a certain point. It's very difficult transitioning back into mainstream American culture, because I had all this experience that people couldn't fathom. Having trained with this traditional Native American doctor, all the time I spent with the Native elders in the peyote meetings. And so most people that I met just had no point of reference. And even trying to date, that could be really challenging, because I felt like, training with this Native doctor is like I kind of lived with the foot in two worlds, between this old Native culture and the fact that the Native people, going in training with this traditional medicine man and going into the ceremonies, there's also that connection with the supernatural, and then and then for me having to relate in this modern day world, which people, as I said, couldn't really understand or grasp these kinds of experiences I had. I would connect to some extent. I mean, after training with my mentor, I enrolled in college. I needed a little time to put my head back together after all that intensity of training, those few years of training. And then from there, I moved to Kansas City. Now, when I started to work with people on my own, it's like that transmission of power that my mentor had passed on to me. It's all that power began to awaken within me as I began to work with other people. And as that happened, it had the effect of, it's like pouring hydrogen peroxide into an open wound. It's like a lot of the traumas of my childhood and adolescence, that all started coming out. And I saw that being reflected back to me in my relationships. I would form attachments to women who were often disinterested, unavailable. Some were quite abusive, and also women that I didn't really have much common ground with. But when you carry a lot of this emotional wounding, your internal models of attachment get really screwed up, for lack of a better term. But I was fully determined to do whatever it took to heal. So I started, initially, not knowing what else to do, I started working with a psychotherapist. And yeah, it gave me an intellectual understanding of my emotional wounding, of a lot of the trauma that I was carrying. But psychotherapy only took me so far. It wasn't actually healing the trauma, and the patterns that were playing out in my intimate or not so intimate relationships, well, they were persisting. And when my desire for love and to be in a relationship with certain women were not being reciprocated, that would evoke enormous amounts of pain. And even more so if they were abusive in some way, if I was getting jerked around emotionally. So I just instinctively, I just somehow knew to dive into the depth of that pain. And I would dive so far into the depths of all those horrendous emotions that at a certain point I could just feel all that intensity of emotion, all those excruciatingly painful emotions. At some point, I could just feel it breaking open and coming out of my body in waves. And then as that happened, I could feel these powerful emanations of warmth that were beginning to emanate from within. And I'm just realizing here, I don't think I turned my phone ringer down, just so we don't get so rudely interrupted. Anyway, and I still work with this practice to this day. I'm not in pain like that, thankfully, any longer. I moved through that over time. But a lot of these traumas that we carry, these deeply entrenched patterns that we enact in our relationships, they're so embedded, they're so hardwired within our body and mind, within our psyche. And I needed intervention to facilitate the healing that I couldn't fully do on my own. I started doing lots of deep tissue body work. And when the opportunity presented itself, I worked with a number of gifted healers. And doing so, whenever I got a chance to work with one of these individuals, some were extraordinarily powerful. And I could feel it was breaking down and beginning to restructure, reformulate some of these distorted models, this internal framework I had that determined how I would bond and form attachments. The problem is these individuals just didn't come around very often. And so I often had to wait like a year and a half between sessions. And yet I was really suffering terribly. And so that's when I started going back at the age of 31 to go on the vision quest, where I go out and fast those 4 days and nights alone in the mountains without food and water. Since that time, I've gone dozens of times, just keep making this pilgrimage back to Oklahoma, to the Wichita Mountains, to go on the next vision quest. Anyway, so over time, as I continue to take these steps, these deep emotional wounds were healing. I became stronger, more resilient. My attachments, unhealthy attachments to women that were either disinterested, unavailable, just not a good match, or even abusive, those attachments dissolved. I was able to just let go. And as I continued to progress, then I found myself attracted to women with whom I could establish co-create healthier, more meaningful relationships. Now, it's still a challenge, though, because I would meet women here and there and develop connections, but there still wasn't quite that resonance. And so a lot of these relationships were usually short-lived. Could be, a few weeks or days, maybe 6 months or something like that. But it just, again, if you just don't resonate. Around the time let's see, when was it? At 1993, I started shifting to the East Coast. I was living in New Mexico, and I loved the beauty of the Southwest, but for some reason there was this inconsistency. I would be working my ass off, just constantly out promoting, and I would draw in a lot of people to work with, but often they would do one or a few sessions and just disappear. And I thought it was just me, but toward the end of the time I was living there, I spoke with all kinds of other practitioners and healing arts, as well as Western allopathic physicians and even yoga and martial arts instructors. And they were all telling me they had the same experience. There was this very high attrition rate. People would just kind of show up for a brief time and just disappear. I don't know. It just seemed like there was this way in which people in New Mexico just had this kind of ungroundedness and didn't follow through. So when the opportunity presented itself to come to the East Coast, New York City and Boston, I jumped at the opportunity. And on a professional level, it was a good move. I had lots of people to work with. And people were way more consistent, and they weren't quite so impoverished. Economically, they were much better off, so I was better compensated, and that certainly helped as well. But attempting to connect on a personal level, well, that was a whole different story. When I lived in Colorado, New Mexico, times I spent, living in Kansas City, Oklahoma, and people were just much more open and friendly. Socially, it was just easy to connect. And one of the things that I, came to realize over time is that that on many levels, I just find it easier to connect with, to relate to women. And so aside from, say, having a girlfriend, I would end up having all these female platonic friends. And I love that, just spending time with them. But when I came to the East Coast, I just found it so difficult to connect. And in New York, there was, I don't think I'd ever encountered the fear, the suspicion, the sense of guardedness or mistrust among women that I found in New York City anywhere else. And when I first came to New York, I did manage to connect with this woman from Syria. And, we did get close for a while. But she took me to the mosque at one point, and they tried to run me through this conversion ritual. And when we came out, she said, "How do you feel now that you're a Muslim?" And I just said, well, I don't know. The whole thing's pretty weird to me. Um, Either you think you know, or you don't know. But to believe, Believe, is to be part of the lie. And so she quickly recoiled in horror, and things quickly disintegrated from there. And I did, for some time grieve the loss of that relationship. But, as the months passed and I healed, I was thinking to myself, well, I really do want to be in a serious long-term relationship. And so I resolved that I was going to approach at least 2 women a day until that happened. And so day after day, no matter where I was, I could be commuting by bus or subway, or on the street, in stores, like Macy's. I could be in supermarket, or Whole Foods, or classes, workshops. If I saw any woman that I found intriguing on any level, even not necessarily that I found all of them that attractive physically, but just if it was just someone I thought, this is a person I might relate to on some level, I would engage, start conversations. And that went on actually for a few years. And actually, after all that time, I had very little to show for it. It's like, initially, I was thinking that, well, it'll help me to work through much of my social awkwardness or shyness. I'll get to where that I'm more comfortable in my interactions and can communicate more effectively. And, I'll develop, some connections, maybe some friendships will come of it. And hey, maybe I'll be fortunate and I'll meet someone that I really connect with. But despite all that effort, I can't say that much came of it. I mean, I had a few spontaneous dates, but often what usually happened is that even if we did exchange contact information, I usually never saw or heard from them again. And there were a few instances that, and I can tell if I've generated, if there was rapport, if there was a mutual liking and enjoyment of each other's company. And there were instances where maybe I had to get up and go to an appointment, and the woman that I would be talking with or hanging out there, and she'd give me a hug or even a kiss on the cheek. But still, if I tried to reach out, send a text or make a call, leave a voicemail or an email, just whatever contact information she had shared with me, I never heard back. Or if I did, maybe there would be an exchange of a few text messages, and that's it. It would just disappear. It would just drop off. And that went on for a few years, and it was just incredibly disheartening. I started to assume that, well, okay, I guess I'm just not the kind of man that women are attracted to. And I felt very sad. It was depressing as hell. It was painful, incredibly painful. But at one point, I just had this intuition. I had been flying around the country a lot, and I'd accrued huge amount of frequent flyer miles on United Airlines. So I just had this intuition, like, get on a plane and go to Sri Lanka. Never been there before. Had no idea what had transpired there over the past few decades. And so I booked the ticket, got on the plane, took off, and landed just after midnight. How do you pronounce it? Bandaranaike International Airport. I was making my way through the lobby, and there was a desk for the government's tourist board. And I was thinking, I'm really exhausted. I need to find a place to sleep. And so the guy was talking to the man working behind the desk, and he made a call, arranged for me to stay in a guest house, and arranged a taxi. And he actually sent one of his subordinates in the taxi with me to make sure that I arrived at my destination. I had no idea how dangerous Sri Lanka was at that time, or the fact that it was in the midst of a brutal civil war that had gone on for nearly 30 years. And as we're cruising down the road in Sri Lanka, and it was dimly lit. And, it was like going back in time, like decades. There were soldiers behind sandbag barricades with machine guns. And they were manning checkpoints. And so I'm cruising down the road in the backseat of the taxi, and first thought in my mind was like, what the fuck am I doing here? It was a little unsettling, to say the least. But I ended up staying in this guest house, and I ventured out the next day, after I woke up, and found my way to this area. It's called Gull Face Green. It's the area alongside the seashore. And the challenges in Sri Lanka, as in many impoverished nations, there's a lot of people that are destitute financially, and they'll do anything to hustle you for money. And I remember sitting on this retainer wall facing the ocean, and there's this derelict on one side of me, and he's hustling me, and I giving him this fuck you look, and the woman on my other side is says, I was really worried about you, but you seem to handle yourself okay. And next thing you know, she's inviting me to after talking for a while, to have dinner with her and her family. And next day I'm out, they're coming to collect me, and I'm going out to one of the villages about half an hour outside the capital city, Colombo. And I ended up, over time, I would stay at their home a good deal of time. And Sri Lanka, again, it was during the wartime, it was incredibly dangerous, very lawless. There are lots of people who should have been locked up in prison that were just running free, and got into some really dangerous situations, and it forced me to rely on my instincts. But on the other hand, despite the fact that it was so dangerous, and I found it much easier to connect. People were more open and friendly. And for women too in Sri Lanka, India as well, they face significant threats to their well-being, danger. And, it's common for, parents in countries like India and Sri Lanka, they're deeply concerned about the safety of their daughters. But despite that, I found that a lot of the women in Sri Lanka would actually, I'd be out, in Sri Lanka, like most of the people at that time, were commuted by bus. There was no subways. Most people didn't have cars. So I could be on the bus, I could be walking on the street. And often women would smile at me, and even more so if they were in groups. If they were in groups, they seemed to be a little more emboldened. And so, and then they would often, again, make conversation. And so it was easy to connect. There does tend to be, from India, I did venture on to India, and I was kind of going back and forth between the two countries. But during the time that I've spent in Sri Lanka is, as I said, a lot of times women would be engaging with me. Of course, not all, and not all women would be interested in me. But I would form these connections. And it's strange in a way because there's this sort of gender segregation. You see it more in India. But, I'd be out and, I would just start conversations and sometimes, I got into a bit of trouble just because I would start connecting with the woman. She would just assume that I would want more than, that I was interested in a romantic relationship. And I was like, no, I enjoy you as a friend. But anyway, during the time that I was spending in Sri Lanka, I actually, I've been in 2 relationships, longer term relationships with 2 different women that I've met during the time that I was in Sri Lanka. I would come back to New York City to work my ass off, but in New York and also working in Boston part of the time, often if I wasn't working, I didn't have anyone to hang out with, and I found it so difficult to connect with women in the city. And again, a lot of that has to do with the fear and guardedness. On one hand, I could understand because, there's many of the women that I have gotten to know that I've worked with and the few that I have developed friendships with, and they would relate to me the experiences they had in which men behave very inappropriately, making very lewd or obscene comments, instances where, for instance, men expose themselves on the subway, grossly disgusting behaviors like that. And so understandably, a lot of them have become more guarded. And also the fact that relationships could be very transitory in New York. So even when these women would meet a guy and begin to form a relationship, sometimes they would end up just getting ghosted, or it turned out the guy would be a narcissist and would just be incredibly hurtful. And so, when you're in a city and you're just overwhelmed like that, and there's just 8.5 million people, and you're not able to process all these things you're going through, you become walled off in ways, you contract, you shut down around those very painful experiences. You lose touch with your intuition. It makes it very difficult to differentiate, who you can trust and all that. But what would happen is I'd come back to New York, I'd work for a while, and then I would go back to Sri Lanka, and that's where I had my personal life. I had all these friends and people I'd connect with, and there, as I said, there were 2 women that, at different periods of time that I was in relationship with. And, so these factors of a lot of people I've spoken with that, and it depends because I know people in the city that they're very much at home, and especially like people in the arts communities, theater, dance, for instance, and they have these huge networks, and within those communities, they're able to meet and connect, and circle of friends and often find a loving companion. But I also know a lot of people that, they day after day, they're getting up early in the morning, they're commuting long distances, they're working long hours, commuting back home. They're exhausted by the end of the day, and they don't have that many opportunities to really meet anyone. For some people, online dating, works. And, before we had Tinder and Bumble and Hinge and Match, everything, it was even that much more difficult. And I heard so many people, especially women, complain about like not having a man in their life. And yet online dating, well, it works well for some people. I know I have friends, people I work with, that have found a loving partner, and they're and to this day, they've a lot of these people have been together for years, are living together, married now, all that, and yet many other people, online dating doesn't work so well, and a lot of just hooking up and then getting ghosted, and just for them, they just see it as just a huge waste of time, and just they've gone through a lot of disappointment as a result of that. And so New York City, for again, some people, right at home here, and they find the love of their life, but far more people that I know have expressed to me, shared with me their own difficulties connecting. I mean, friends of mine that living back in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the wife is Norwegian, grew up in Norway, the husband native New Mexican, and she wanted to return to Norway to live there. And so they packed up and moved to Norway for a couple of years with their young son. And years later, when I reconnected with them after they moved back to Albuquerque, and the husband was sharing with me the whole time they lived in Norway, he wasn't able to make any friends at all, except for a handful of expatriates who were in the same boat. He said that the local population, that they were polite, but they didn't really have much interest in engaging with them. So if you're in a place where people tend to be more guarded, tend to be on sensory overload, like New York City, and where you just have massive amounts, you have people living above and below on all sides of you, and just all the noise and crowding and everything. You're in an environment, among a culture where people are just not that open and engaging. That can make it difficult to find someone with whom you can establish a meaningful and fulfilling connection. I know people who living out in more rural areas, and for them it can be difficult because it's just small population base. There's not that many individuals to choose from, and if that's if you find yourself in an environment, like for me, times I've been in New York City, I found it very difficult to connect. But despite that, I would still encourage you, as much as you can, go out, find the people, whether it's, there's, in New York City, they have this publication, Time Out New York, and it lists all these different events. There's Meetup, for instance, with all kinds of groups, people that share certain interests. And so if you could find people that share your interest, if you tend to resonate with people of a certain cultural background, like for me, I do have that connection with Native Americans. I could also, in many ways, I resonate with the people in Sri Lanka among the Sinhalese and Tamil communities, and also people that I would encounter in India as well. And there are enough cultural similarities. You know, the fact that I lived among Native Americans, I was trained by this traditional Native American doctor and medicine man. So I'd be over in India and Sri Lanka, and people got it. I mean, they recognized that I had this gift of healing, and they were very receptive. I ended up staying in this ashram in Powai, which is, I guess you call it a suburb of Mumbai, or which was otherwise known as Bombay. And word started going out, and all these people, while I was there, they were wanting to squeeze in and have me work with them. You know, it was just, the word was spreading. And so people in this part of the world, you know, they just have much greater appreciation for the kind of work, you know, the kind of healing gift that I possess. And I would have loved to, like, you know, had it not been for the economic disparity, you know, a lot of people in India and Sri Lanka would make the equivalent of maybe $3, or if they're fortunate, maybe, you know, $15, $20 a day. So they couldn't really afford to compensate me. And so I'd be working my ass off just to make enough money just to survive. You know, if I'm working there. So out of economic necessity, I was forced to return to the United States. And because of that, I was just commuting back and forth. So, so again, whether you connect to the extent you connect, or maybe you're finding it difficult to connect, so much of that is going to depend on external factors as well. As you heal, you know, what I found is as I continue to progress along my own healing journey, that I found that more and more people were drawn to me, and the quality of my relationships improved. There was greater depth of intimacy, and even to this day, I find that it continues to evolve. But at the same time, you know, it's like I'm back in New York City, and it's a lot of the same experience. You know, all the growth, the healing that I've gone through, I don't really see it reflected back to me so much when I'm in New York City. Maybe people are more responsive to my work, but I don't see as much follow through either when I'm in New York City, as I do in some other places that I've been. Yeah, and if you're in a part of the world where people are part of the world or city where people are just not as friendly, not as open, not as engaging, if they're more guarded, if they're just more reserved, more standoffish, then that can make it difficult to connect. It's, you know, it takes two, you know, to form a connection. And so part of it's you, but it also depends on the, you know, the population base with whom you're interacting. So important to keep in mind, because I've seen too many people that maybe they're in a place and they either didn't resonate so well with the local population, people were more guarded, standoffish, are, you know, like in New York too, just on sensory overload. And New York, in many ways, it could be harsh, you know, and but, you know, again, I see people in environments like I'm describing, and for them, connections are not coming so easily, despite the fact that they're healing and evolving. It may not be you, you know, it's like I said, when I was in New York, I was thinking like, well, maybe I'm not the kind of man that women are attracted to. I'd go other places. times I spent up in Vermont. At one point, I spent a few months in Ohio. Within about a week's time, I end up in a relationship with this woman that, it just kind of happened. And, so there are ways in which when you're in a place where people are more open and engaging and friendly, it's just going to be a lot easier to connect. So, said a lot here, to give you a lot to think about. Take all these things into consideration. And I will leave you with that for now. I know. Mm-hmm.